They say the Pacific Northwest is a place where secrets go to drown. In the late 1980s, Seattle wasn't the tech hub of glass and steel you see today. It was a gritty, rain-slicked landscape of industrial decay and neon shadows. While the high-rises of the downtown core were fueled by the cold adrenaline of corporate greed, the streets below were filled with the forgotten. Thousands of souls were slipping through the cracks of a fraying social safety net. But in the winter of 1988, a legend began to grow in the dark alleyways and under the dripping highway overpasses. They spoke of a white van that appeared in the dead of night, offering the only thing that mattered in a world that had turned its back: a hot meal. They called him Saint Artie. The police would later call him the most methodical predator in the history of the coast. But to understand the monster, you have to understand the hunger. This is the story of the Butcher of Mercy. The steam didn't just rise from the pot. It crawled. It rose like a ghost from a shallow grave, twisting and shivering into the freezing Seattle night. It was November 1988, a time of neon, concrete, and desperation. The rain was relentless, a cold, needle-like drizzle that blurred the city into a smear of bruised purple and electric blue. Deep in the shadow of the Alaskan Way Viaduct, the air was thick. It smelled of diesel exhaust, wet soot, and something else. Something rich, something savory, something that made the hollowed-out stomachs of the men in line ache with a primal, terrifying hunger. In the center of this gray world stood the van, a 1974 Chevrolet step van, the color of a guttering candle. The paint was peeling in long, jagged strips, revealing the rusted metal beneath like a scab. And behind the folding metal table stood the man they called Saint Artie. Arthur Penhaligon didn't look like a saint. He looked like a piece of the city that had been forgotten. His brow was carved from granite. His eyes were two chips of cold, dark glass that seemed to absorb what little light the street lamps provided. His hands were encased in translucent latex gloves that hissed as he moved. They were steady, the hands of a man who knew exactly where the bone meets the joint, a man who understood the physics of flesh. "Easy now, Silas." Artie's voice was a low, gravelly hum, a vibration you felt in your teeth. "There's plenty of protein in tonight's batch. It'll keep the frost out of your marrow." He filled a heavy, waxed paper bowl to the absolute brim. The stew was dark, mahogany-rich, filled with chunks of tender, pale meat and root vegetables that had softened into the broth until they were almost translucent. In 1988, you didn't ask questions about a free hot meal. You didn't look for the source. You just swallowed it down before the cold took you. Silas, whose face was a roadmap of tragedies and cheap gin, took the bowl with trembling fingers. He didn't see the truth. He only saw a chance to survive another hour. Artie watched him take that first bite. He watched the old man's eyes close in a moment of pure, fleeting ecstasy. It was a moment of communion. "Enjoy him, Silas," Artie thought. His face remained a mask of stone. He spent his life stepping over you on his way to his luxury office. He treated you like a stain on his Italian loafers. It's only fair that in the end, he finally gives you something back. The resource in the pot tonight had once been a man named Randall Vance. 3 days ago, Randall was a man of immense power. He was a consultant for a firm specializing in urban renewal, which was just a polite way of saying he burned out low-income tenants to make room for luxury condos. He smelled of expensive bay rum and arrogance. He had a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. Now, Randall was the base for a hearty ragout, simmering at a steady 190 degrees in the back of a rusted Chevy. Inside the van, the space was a masterpiece of macabre efficiency. It was scrubbed with industrial-grade bleach, the sharp, chemical scent fighting a losing battle against the metallic, copper tang of blood that seemed etched into the floorboards. Against the far wall, professional-grade butcher's hooks swayed gently with the rhythmic vibration of the overhead traffic. Clink, clink, clink. To the cops driving by in their boxy Caprice cruisers, it was just another soup kitchen, a charity, a nuisance to be ignored. But Artie knew better. He wasn't just a provider. He was an alchemist of justice. He was taking the waste of the upper class, the predators who grew fat on the misery of the poor, and he was converting them into the fuel that kept the disposable people alive for one more night. It was a perfect, silent economy. A young woman stepped up next. She was shivering, her teeth rattling like dice in a cup. Artie felt that familiar, cold heat in his chest. "Duty. Double portion for you tonight," he whispered. The steam curled around his head like a gray, tattered halo. As he dipped the ladle, the flash of a patrol car's lights drifted past, red and blue reflecting in the oily puddles. The officers didn't stop. They didn't even look. To them, the people in this line were just a collective stain on the sidewalk, something to be washed away by the winter rains. Artie watched their taillights disappear into the fog. He felt a grim, silent irony. The police were out there, hunting for monsters in the dark, searching for drug deals and petty thefts, while the most prolific killer in the Pacific Northwest stood 5 feet away, serving the primary evidence of a murder in a disposable cup. He looked down at the stew. A small piece of cartilage floated to the surface. With a practiced, almost delicate flick of his thumb, he pushed it back down into the dark where it belonged. The city was hungry, and Arthur Penhaligon had a lot more work to do before the sun rose over the Sound. The menu for the coming week was already planned. There was a predatory lender in the Queen Anne district who had been ripening for days, and Artie knew exactly which herbs would pair best with a man who had spent his life bleeding the city dry. To understand the man the media would later call the Butcher of Mercy, we have to go back. Before the white van, before the mahogany-rich stew, and before the bodies began to vanish into the fog of the Pacific Northwest. We have to go back to 1984, a year of industrial death. In the south end of Seattle, the air didn't smell like rain. It smelled like rust and dying dreams. This was the era of the Great Closure, where the heartbeat of the city, its factories and packing plants, simply stopped. And for Arthur Penhaligon, the silence was the loudest sound he had ever heard. Before he was a ghost in the streets, Arthur was employee number 402 at the Holloway & Sons meatpacking plant. For 22 years, his world was defined by the overhead rails and the rhythmic, metallic clink of carcasses moving through the cold room. He wasn't just a laborer. He was the surgeon of the slaughterhouse. While other men hacked and tore, Arthur moved with a grace that was almost unsettling. He knew the exact pressure required to find a joint in the dark. He understood the subtle, wet give of a tendon before it parted. He respected the anatomy. He believed that every creature, even in death, deserved a certain level of professional dignity. He saw the body as a puzzle to be solved, a collection of resources that should never be wasted. But in the winter of '84, the efficiency experts arrived. They were men in charcoal suits who carried clipboards instead of knives. They didn't care about the art of the cut. They cared about the bottom line. They shuttered Holloway & Sons on a frozen Tuesday morning. By Friday, the massive boilers were cold, and the men who had spent their lives there were discarded like scrap metal. Arthur walked out of those gates with nothing but his personal set of knives, relics he had borrowed on his final shift, and a growing, hollow ache in his chest. He was a man with a highly specialized skill set in a world that suddenly had no use for him. He was 50 years old, and for the first time in his life, he felt like dead weight. He retreated to a cramped, damp apartment on the edge of the International District. The building was a rotting relic, held together by layers of lead paint and the collective misery of its tenants. The walls were so thin, he could hear his neighbors weeping through the plaster. This was where he met the Hendersons, an elderly couple who had lived in 4B since the Korean War. They were kind, frail, and utterly defenseless. And this was where he met the man who would become his first project, Mr. Gathers. Gathers was the landlord, though predator was a more accurate term. He was a man who wore too many gold rings on fat, nicotine-stained fingers, and possessed a heart that had long ago turned to gristle. He smelled of cheap vanilla cigarettes and the greasy scent of a man who lived off the desperation of others. In mid-December, during the coldest snap the city had seen in a decade, Arthur stood in the hallway and watched Gathers toss the Hendersons' belongings into the slush on the sidewalk. An old wool quilt, a box of fading black and white photographs, a lifetime of quiet dignity. All discarded like offal in the gutter because they were 3 days late on the rent. "It's just business, Arthur," Gathers had said, leaning against the door frame and exhaling a cloud of sweet, sickly smoke. "The neighborhood is changing. Upward mobility. These people? They're just draining the system. They're dead weight." That phrase, dead weight, echoed in Arthur's mind like a hammer on an anvil. In the meatpacking plant, dead weight was something you processed. It was something you converted. You didn't just throw it away. You made it useful. As Arthur watched the Hendersons huddle together in the freezing rain, something in his mind shifted. The gears of the surgeon began to turn again. He realized that Gathers wasn't a human being. He was a resource. A bloated, overfed resource that was currently going to waste, while the people around him starved. The night of the first harvest was silent. The rain had turned into a blinding, horizontal sleet that kept the streets empty. Gathers was walking to his Cadillac, his heavy coat collar turned up against the wind. He didn't hear Arthur's boots on the wet pavement. He didn't see the flash of the 10-inch boning knife, the steel Arthur had kept razor sharp in a velvet-lined case. The strike was perfect. It was silent, professional, and utterly clinical. There was no struggle, only the sudden, heavy slump of a man who had finally outlived his utility. Arthur didn't feel rage. He didn't feel the frantic rush of a killer. He felt clarity. He moved the body with the practiced ease of a man who had hauled 1,000 sides of beef. He took Gathers to the only place where Arthur still felt like he belonged, an abandoned warehouse near the docks where the power was still illegally tapped and the floor drains still functioned. Under a single, flickering industrial bulb, Arthur went to work. He felt the old rhythm returning to his shoulders. Slice. Separate, clean. The city was full of men like Gathers, men who consumed everything and produced nothing but misery. But Arthur could change that. He could be the great equalizer. He spent the next 48 hours over a large cast-iron pot. He added potatoes he had scavenged from the back of a grocery store, onions that were slightly bruised but still firm, and the contribution from Mr. Gathers. He seasoned the broth with salt, black pepper, and a touch of wild rosemary he found growing near the highway. The first bowl he served was to the Hendersons, who were huddling in the doorway of a closed pharmacy. They didn't recognize him in the shadows. They just took the steaming bowl with blue-tinged fingers and wept with gratitude. "Thank you," the old woman whispered, her breath hitching as the warmth hit her throat. "This is so rich. What is it?" Arthur looked at her, his eyes reflecting the distant, cold street lamps. "It's justice, ma'am," he said softly. "It's finally justice." In that moment, Arthur Penhaligon, the worker, was gone. The butcher of mercy had been born. He realized his purpose wasn't to kill, it was to repurpose. He was going to feed the city, one parasite at a time. And as he looked at his hands, he saw they were no longer empty. They were full of work. The I-5 corridor is a vein that pumps life between two nations, stretching from the rainy docks of Seattle to the glass and brick heart of Vancouver, British Columbia. In the late 80s, the border wasn't the fortress it is today. It was a line in the dirt, guarded by men in polyester uniforms and the heavy gray mist of the Pacific Northwest. For Arthur Penhaligon, the border was simply another station in his grand design. He realized that the hunger didn't stop at the 49th parallel. The deadweight was universal. And to keep his kitchen running, he needed to expand his territory. But transporting his specific brand of mercy across an international boundary required a level of cold-blooded precision that would have terrified a professional smuggler. The white Chevy step van rumbled north under a sky the color of a bruised plum. Arthur sat behind the wheel, his hand steady on the thin plastic rim. Beside him, on the passenger seat, lay a stack of folded paper maps and a Canadian entry manifest he'd filled out with practiced, sloping handwriting. In the back, the van was a temple of deceptive order. The large stainless steel pots were secured with heavy-duty bungee cords. The smell of industrial bleach was overwhelming, a chemical shield designed to mask the faint, iron-rich scent that no amount of scrubbing could truly erase. Crossing the border at Blaine, Washington in 1989 was a game of psychology. There were no retinal scans, no digital databases that updated in real time. There was only the officer's intuition and the look in a driver's eyes. As Arthur pulled up to the booth at the Peace Arch crossing, he rolled down his window, letting in the sharp, salty air of the Boundary Bay. The Canadian customs officer was young, his skin flushed pink by the morning chill. He leaned out of his booth, looking at the rusted white van with a mixture of boredom and mild curiosity. "Purpose of your visit to Canada, sir?" the officer asked, his breath misting in the air. "Charity work," Arthur replied, his voice a smooth, comforting baritone. "I run a mobile kitchen for the shelters in the downtown east side, bringing up some bulk supplies and equipment to help out a local mission." The officer glanced at the back of the van. He saw the gleam of the stainless steel and the stacks of paper bowls. He saw a man who looked like a weary grandfather, a man with calloused hands and a face that suggested a lifetime of honest, back-breaking labor. The officer didn't see the false floor beneath the pots. He didn't see the specialized tools tucked away in a hidden compartment, the surgical saws and the heavy-duty meat hooks. He saw a saint. With a sharp nod and a stamp of the paperwork, the gate lifted. Arthur Penhaligon was officially international. Vancouver was a mirror image of Seattle, but with a sharper, more jagged edge. The downtown east side was a war zone of addiction and abandonment, a place where the human trash was piled high in the alleyways. And at the top of the hill, in the glittering offices of the West End, lived the men who had built their fortunes on that abandonment. Arthur's target for this trip was a man named Douglas Sterling. Sterling was a high-level city official, a man responsible for the rezoning of low-income hotels. He had a reputation for taking kickbacks from developers while signing eviction notices with a gold-plated fountain pen. He was a man of immense appetite, expensive scotch, fine cigars, and a complete lack of empathy for the lives he dismantled. To Arthur, Sterling was a prime specimen. He was a harvest that would feed the very people he had stepped on for a decade. The hunt was methodical. Arthur spent 2 days tracking Sterling's routine from the shadows of his van. He watched the man leave his luxury apartment, watched him dine at 5-star bistros, and watched him treat the world like his personal footstool. On the third night, the rain in Vancouver turned into a deluge. Sterling was walking to his garage after a late-night gala, his gait slightly unsteady from the scotch. He was alone, shielded by the arrogance of his own status. The strike occurred in the damp silence of an underground parking level. It was over in 4 seconds. No struggle, no screams, just the cold, efficient application of Arthur's skill. He didn't waste time. He loaded the resource into the back of the van and drove to a pre-rented industrial unit in the outskirts of Burnaby. This was his temporary kitchen, a place of cold concrete and high-capacity drains. Under the hum of a portable generator, the surgeon went to work. The process was faster now, refined by experience. He disassembled Douglas Sterling with the same professional detachment he had once applied to prime beef. He felt a sense of poetic justice as he prepared the Vancouver batch. He used local ingredients: potatoes from the Fraser Valley, carrots from a nearby market, and the ego of a man who thought he was untouchable. The next evening, the white van appeared on the corner of Main and Hastings. The line of hungry ghosts formed almost instantly. They stood in the rain, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow, and Arthur, with a gentle smile and a steady hand, began to pour. He served the Sterling stew to the very men and women the official had planned to sweep into the gutter. "God bless you, Artie," a young man whispered, clutching the warm bowl as if it were a holy relic. Arthur looked at him, the reflection of the Vancouver neon dancing in his dark eyes. "Eat up, son," he said. "The city finally provided for you tonight. It's exactly what you deserve." As he watched the crowd eat, Arthur felt a profound sense of balance. He had crossed the line, both literally and figuratively. He was no longer just a local killer. He was a force of nature, a shadow moving between two countries, turning the greed of the North and South into the survival of the forgotten. The mercy ration was growing, and as he prepared to head back across the border, he was already thinking about his next resource. The Pacific Northwest was full of parasites, and Arthur Penhaligon had a very large pot to fill. By the spring of 1989, Arthur Penhaligon had achieved a state of perfect, terrifying duality. To his neighbors in the quiet, rain-drenched district of Ballard, he was just Artie, the soft-spoken retired man who spent his afternoons meticulously weeding his garden and painting his porch. They saw a man of habit, a man who represented the vanishing values of an older, simpler Seattle. But beneath the floorboards of his modest gray bungalow lay another world entirely. This was his true workshop, his Cathedral of Bleach. It was here that the transition from human to resource took place. It was here that Arthur felt he was finally doing the work of a god who had long ago abandoned the Pacific Northwest. Arthur's home was an exercise in radical cleanliness. The air didn't smell of dust or old age. It smelled of high-concentrate pine cleaner and surgical spirits. He lived a life of ascetic discipline. He ate simple meals of bread and tea as if he were a monk preparing for a holy rite. But the heart of the house was the basement. He had spent years reinforcing the walls with sound-dampening insulation and installing industrial-grade ventilation that whispered like a dying man's breath. The floor was sloped toward a central drain, and the walls were lined with white ceramic tiles he had laid himself. In the center sat a massive, professional-grade stainless steel preparation table, flanked by a walk-in freezer that hummed with a low, constant vibration. This was where he brought the dead weight to be redeemed. His third major harvest was a man named Victor Kral. Kral was a debt collector for a high-interest predatory lending firm. He was a man who specialized in the hard touch, a man who took pride in repossessing heaters from the elderly in midwinter and seizing the vans of struggling contractors. He was a bully with a cheap tie and an expensive car, a man who viewed poverty as a character flaw. Arthur had watched him for weeks, observing the way Kral sneered at the people whose lives he dismantled. To Arthur, Kral wasn't just a criminal. He was a toxin. On a Tuesday night, under the rhythmic thrum of a heavy spring downpour, Arthur intercepted Kral in a darkened alleyway behind a dive bar. The strike was so fast that Kral's cigarette was still burning on the wet asphalt long after he had been loaded into the white van. The fourth was even more ambitious. Judge Harrison Vane was a fixture of the King County Courthouse, a man who spoke of law and order while accepting envelopes of cash in the shadows of private clubs. He was the man who handed down maximum sentences to the petty thieves while letting the corporate embezzlers walk free for a price. He was a man of immense vanity, convinced that his black robe made him invincible. Arthur took him from the parking garage of a high-end country club. Vane had tried to bargain, offering money, power, and influence. But Arthur didn't want his money. He wanted his contribution to the great work. Back in the Cathedral of Bleach, Arthur worked with a sense of religious fervor. He didn't see the bodies on his table as people anymore. They were components of a grand social alchemy. He worked through the night, the surgical steel of his saws screaming softly as they bit into bone. He felt a profound sense of peace. Each cut was a prayer. Each ounce of fat rendered down was a step toward a more balanced world. He began to keep meticulous logs in a leather-bound ledger, not out of a need for trophies, but out of a sense of administrative duty. He recorded the weight of the resource and the yield of the harvest, treating the entire process with the clinical coldness of a government auditor. As the large industrial pot simmered on the stove, Arthur would sit in a wooden chair and watch the steam rise. He began to hear voices in the white noise of the ventilation system. Not the voices of ghosts, but a collective hum of the thousands he had fed. He felt a heat in his chest that he could only describe as sanctity. He was the only one who truly saw the city for what it was, a machine that consumed the weak. And he was the only one brave enough to feed the machine its own masters. He was the butcher, the chef, and the priest. The Kral and Vane batch was particularly rich. He used a blend of Northwest herbs, sage, thyme, and a hint of juniper to cut through the heavy richness of the meat. He drove the van through the streets with a sense of triumph. When he served the stew to the men under the viaduct, he didn't just see hungry people. He saw his congregation. He watched them eat the judge who would have jailed them and the collector who would have robbed them. It was a dark, silent communion. "Do you feel that, Silas?" Arthur asked softly as the old man scraped the bottom of his bowl. "That's the taste of the system finally working for you." Silas just nodded, his face lit by the flickering orange glow of a nearby barrel fire. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the warmth in his belly. Arthur looked up at the towering skyscrapers of the downtown core, their windows gleaming like the eyes of predators. He wasn't afraid of them anymore. He was their gardener. He was pruning the city, cutting away the rot so the roots could survive. He felt untouchable, shielded by the sheer invisibility of his kindness. But in the shadows of the precinct, a man named Elias Thorne was beginning to look at a small, golden object found in a bowl of soup. And the first cracks in Arthur's cathedral were beginning to form. Evidence is a stubborn thing. You can scrub the floors with bleach until the fumes burn your lungs. You can render tissue into broth and grind bone into powder. But the truth has a way of snagging on the jagged edges of reality. In the world of forensic science in 1989, investigations didn't move at the speed of a fiber optic cable. They moved at the speed of a detective's heartbeat and the paper trail of a dental record. For Arthur Penhaligon, perfection was an obsession. But even the most meticulous butcher can forget that not everything in a man can be digested. Sometimes, the very thing that signifies a man's wealth becomes the hook that pulls his killer out of the shadows. The night was a carbon copy of 1,000 others in Seattle, cold, damp, and smelling of the harbor. A man named Benny, a regular in the midnight line under the viaduct, sat huddled in a doorway, cradling a bowl of Artie's famous beef ragu. Benny was a man who had lost his mind to the horrors of the jungle in '68 and his dignity to the bottle in '74. He ate slowly, savoring the warmth, until his teeth struck something hard, something metallic. At first, he thought it was a stone or a piece of buckshot. But when he spat it into his palm, it gleamed under the flickering amber light of a street lamp. It was a 3-unit dental bridge, crafted from solid 18-karat gold. To Benny, this wasn't a piece of a crime scene. It was a miracle. It was 3 nights in a warm motel and a bottle of the good stuff. The next morning, he shuffled into a small, dusty pawn shop on Yesler Way, hoping to trade his found treasure for a handful of 20s. But the pawnbroker was a man of sharp instincts. He saw the bit of dried, darkened tissue still clinging to the crevices of the gold. He saw the terror in Benny's eyes. And more importantly, he saw a way to stay on the good side of the local precinct. He didn't reach for his wallet. He reached for the rotary phone under the counter. Enter Detective Elias Thorne. Thorne was a man who looked like he had been built out of old case files and stale coffee. He was 45, but in the harsh fluorescent light of the Seattle Police Department, he looked 60. His office was a graveyard of missing persons folders. Men of status and wealth who had simply vanished into the Pacific Northwest mist. Randall Vance, Douglas Sterling, Victor Krall. The names were taped to a corkboard, a constellation of the disappeared that kept Thorne awake at night. When the call came in from the pawn shop, Thorne didn't expect much. Most finds in the gutter were just trash. But when he held that gold bridge in a pair of tweezers, he felt a familiar, cold prickle at the base of his neck. Thorne took the bridge to a forensic dentist in the University District. It was an analog process. Hours of poring through physical charts and microfilm. But by the second day, they found a match. The bridge didn't belong to a drifter or a ghost. It belonged to Randall Vance, the urban renewal consultant who had gone missing 6 months prior. The discovery sent a shockwave through the department. Vance's disappearance had been treated as a potential kidnapping or a high-stakes flight from debt. Nobody had considered that a piece of him would turn up in the pocket of a homeless man who claimed he found it in a bowl of soup. Thorne sat in his darkened office, the smoke from his Camel cigarette curling around the green-shaded lamp. He interviewed Benny for 4 hours. The story never changed. The white van, the kind man with the stone face, the hot stew that tasted like heaven. Thorne looked at the map of the city, marking the locations Benny mentioned. He began to see a pattern, not of where the victims lived, but where they were being consumed. It was a horrifying, nonsensical theory. Who would kill a man like Randall Vance just to feed the poor? In the greed-driven landscape of the late 80s, it was a motive that didn't fit any known profile. Thorne contacted the RCMP in Vancouver. He asked a simple, ridiculous question. Are your missing millionaires turning up in soup kitchens? The silence on the other end of the line lasted for a long time. Then, a soft-spoken inspector named Miller replied, "We don't have a body, Elias, but we do have a silver cufflink found in a trash can behind a mission on Hastings Street last week. We thought it was a fluke." The cracks in the Cathedral of Bleach were widening. Arthur Penhaligon was still out there, driving his white Chevy through the rain, convinced of his own divinity. He didn't know that Benny had spat out the truth. He didn't know that Elias Thorne was now watching the soup lines, not with pity, but with the cold, calculating eyes of a hunter. The Mercy Ration was no longer a secret. It was a trail of breadcrumbs made of gold and silver, leading straight to a basement that smelled of industrial bleach. The game of cat and mouse had begun, and in the analog world of 1989, the mouse had just made his first and perhaps final mistake. In the winter of 1989, the invisible thread between Seattle and Vancouver began to tighten. Criminal investigations in the analog age were a war of attrition, fought with manila folders, grainy black and white surveillance photos, and the steady soles of detectives' boots. Elias Thorne was a man who understood that monsters don't hide in the dark. They hide in plain sight, camouflaged by the very routines of the city. He knew that the gold bridge found in Benny's stew wasn't a fluke. It was a signature. Now, he just had to find the hand that had signed it. To do that, he had to look beyond the glittering skyline and into the heart of the Mercy Ration. The meeting took place in a cramped, smoke-filled office at the Pacific Highway border crossing. Outside, the rain lashed against the windows, a gray curtain that seemed to unify the two nations. Detective Thorne sat across from Inspector Miller of the RCMP. Between them lay a spread of photographs, the missing men. Sterling, Vance, Krall, Vane. On paper, they had nothing in common. They lived in different neighborhoods, moved in different circles, and disappeared on different days of the week. But Thorne had found the denominator. It wasn't who they were, but what they represented: power, greed, and the systemic consumption of the weak. And then there was the van. "We've been combing through the bridge toll logs and the border manifests," Miller said, sliding a grainy photograph across the desk. It was a shot from a security camera at a Vancouver bank, taken 2 nights before Douglas Sterling vanished. In the blurred background, parked half on the sidewalk, was a white Chevrolet step van. It's a ghost. No commercial markings, no company logo. Just a clean white box. We found similar sightings near the Vance crime scene in Seattle and a garage in Burnaby. Thorne leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. "It's not just a vehicle, Miller. It's a mobile processing plant. Think about it. Why haven't we found a single drop of blood? Why no bodies in the sound? Because the evidence is being walked away in paper bowls every night at 3 a.m. The theory was so grotesque it made Miller's jaw tighten. But the evidence was mounting. Thorne had spent the last week interviewing the Invisibles, the homeless population that lived under the viaducts. He didn't come at them with handcuffs. He came with cigarettes and a quiet, respectful voice. He heard the same name over and over: Saint Artie. They spoke of him with a reverence that bordered on the religious. He was the man who never missed a night, the man who brought the good meat, the man who looked at them like they were human beings. "We need a positive ID on the driver," Thorne stated, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "But we can't just kick in his door. If he's as methodical as I think he is, his kitchen will be spotless. We need to catch him with the product. We need to see him in the act of the harvest." The Joint Task Force began a covert operation known as Project Ghost. They started tracking every white step van registered in the tri-state area in British Columbia. It was a monumental task. In 1989, there were thousands of them. Delivery trucks, laundry vans, mobile repair shops. But Thorne was looking for something specific. A van that moved at odd hours. A van that crossed the border with suspicious frequency. A van that felt too clean for the streets it inhabited. Back in Ballard, Arthur Penhaligon was starting to feel the shift in the air. He was a man tuned to the vibrations of his environment, a hunter who knew when the wind had changed. He noticed the same gray sedan parked 2 blocks from his house 3 days in a row. He saw the way the patrol cars slowed down just a fraction longer when they passed his van under the viaduct. He wasn't afraid. He believed his mission was sanctioned by a higher moral authority. But he was becoming more selective. The dead weight was still out there. But the surgeon had to be more precise with his incisions. Arthur decided it was time for a final, grand gesture before he moved his operation further east, perhaps toward Spokane or Calgary. He had identified a new target, a man who embodied everything he loathed, a man who was the very architect of the misery Arthur spent his nights trying to alleviate. But as Arthur sat in his kitchen, sharpening his knives with a rhythmic, metallic shink, 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 he didn't realize that Elias Thorne was no longer just a name on a police report. Thorne was a shadow in the rain, a bloodhound who had finally caught the scent of the bleach and the bone. The hunt was narrowing. Project Ghost had narrowed the list down to 3 vehicles. One was owned by a bakery, one by a chemical supply company, and one was registered to a retired meatpacker named Arthur Penhaligon. When Thorne saw that name and the history of Holloway and Sons, the last piece of the puzzle clicked into place with the cold, heavy sound of a prison bolt. "I found him, Miller," Thorne whispered into the receiver of his desk phone, his eyes fixed on Arthur's driver's license photo. "The saint doesn't live in heaven. He lives in a gray bungalow in Ballard, and it's time we saw what's cooking in his basement." The stage was set for the final confrontation. The police began 24-hour surveillance, waiting for Arthur to make his move. They didn't know that Arthur was already preparing his most ambitious recipe yet. The city was about to witness the collision of 2 different kinds of justice. The one written in law books and the one served in a paper bowl. Shadows don't just follow, they cling. In the rain-choked streets of Seattle, the line between the hunter and the hunted began to dissolve into a gray, shivering haze. Detective Elias Thorne knew he was dealing with a master of invisibility. Arthur Penhaligon had spent decades blending into the background of the industrial world, a man who functioned as a gear in a machine that eventually discarded him. But now, that gear was grinding back to life, fueled by a dark, righteous purpose. Project Ghost was no longer just a file on a desk. It was a living, breathing stakeout. The police were waiting for a slip-up, a single moment of human weakness in a man who seemed to have purged himself of everything but his mission. The surveillance operation was centered on a nondescript gray sedan parked 2 blocks from Arthur's bungalow in Ballard. Inside, Thorne and a rotating team of officers lived on lukewarm coffee and the static hum of the radio. They watched Arthur through long-range lenses as he tended to his garden, his movements rhythmic and peaceful. He looked like a man at rest, a grandfatherly figure who had found peace in his retirement. But Thorne didn't see a gardener. He saw a predator who had converted his basement into a tomb. Every time Arthur stepped toward his white van, the air in the surveillance car grew thick with anticipation. They needed him to move. They needed him to hunt. Arthur Penhaligon was not a fool. He had spent his life reading the subtle signs of the slaughterhouse, the way the air changed when the animals sensed the end, the shift in the light before the blades began to move. He felt the police presence like a static charge on his skin. He saw the gray sedan, saw the way the driver never looked directly at his house, and recognized the professional stillness of the men inside. For the first time in his new life, Arthur felt a flicker of something he hadn't experienced in years: hesitation. His logical mind told him to stop, to dismantle the kitchen and disappear into the vast forests of the Cascades. But the mercy ration was a hungry god, and it demanded another sacrifice. He had already chosen his next target. Alistair Finch was a predatory insurance tycoon who had made millions by denying life-saving treatments to the terminally ill. He was a man who lived in a fortress of glass and steel on Queen Anne Hill, protected by private security and a legal team that functioned like a Praetorian guard. To Arthur, Finch was the ultimate deadweight, a man whose very existence was a parasite on the suffering of the city. The plan was already etched into Arthur's mind. He would take Finch not with force, but with the invisibility of his profession. He would be the ghost in the machine. On a Thursday night, as a heavy fog rolled in from the sound, Arthur made his move. He didn't take the van at first. He walked out his back door, moved through the interconnected alleyways of Ballard with the grace of a shadow, and picked up a stolen sedan he had stashed 3 miles away weeks prior. He watched the police surveillance team in his rearview mirror as he led them on a slow, agonizing loop through the city. He was testing them, measuring their patience, feeling the leash they had put on him. He saw the gray sedan struggling to maintain a discreet distance in the worsening visibility. Thorne, sitting in the passenger seat of the tailing car, felt the sweat prickling under his collar. "He knows," Thorne whispered, his eyes fixed on the red taillights ahead. "He's toyed with us for 3 hours. He's looking for a gap." Thorne knew the risk. If they moved in now, they had nothing but a gold bridge and some circumstantial sightings. They needed the product. They needed the butcher with a knife in his hand. But Arthur was leading them into the labyrinth of the industrial docks, a place where the fog turned into a solid wall of white. Arthur played the game with cold, calculated precision. He utilized the narrow, one-way streets and the rhythmic timing of the drawbridges over the Lake Washington Ship Canal. In a move that displayed his intimate knowledge of the city's geography, he timed his crossing of the Fremont Bridge just as the bells began to ring for a passing tugboat. As the massive steel leaves rose into the air, Arthur slipped through, leaving Thorne and the police car trapped on the other side, their sirens muffled by the fog and the machinery. Arthur didn't go for Finch that night. He knew he had won the first round, but he also knew the window was closing. He returned the stolen car, walked back to his house through the shadows, and sat in his darkened kitchen. He looked at his hands in the moonlight. They were steady, but the weight of the city was beginning to press down on him. He realized that the mercy ration had become a trap. The police were no longer just an obstacle. They were part of the ecosystem. As the sun began to rise over the rain-slicked rooftops, Arthur descended into his basement. He began to prep the large pots, the sound of the steel clinking in the silence like a funeral knell. He knew that the next hunt would be his last. He had to make it a masterpiece. He had to serve a meal that the city would never forget. And in the police precinct, Elias Thorne sat over a map of Queen Anne Hill, his finger hovering over the estate of Alistair Finch. The bloodhound had lost the scent for a moment, but he knew exactly where the fox was going to ground. The final harvest was no longer a matter of if, but when. Every predator eventually overreaches. In the cold, clinical mind of Arthur Penhaligon, there was no room for error, only for the inevitable. But the pressure of being hunted changes the chemistry of a man. It sharpens the senses, yes, but it also creates a frantic, desperate need for a grand finale. Arthur knew the police were closing in. He could smell the stale coffee and the cheap tobacco of the surveillance teams on the wind. Instead of retreating, he decided to strike at the very heart of the city's arrogance. He chose Alistair Finch, the architect of medical misery, as his final contribution to the mercy ration. It was meant to be his masterpiece, the ultimate proof of his divinity. But in the shadows of Queen Anne Hill, the surgeon finally met a variable he couldn't control. The night of the final harvest was a symphony of chaos. A massive storm was rolling in from the Pacific, tearing at the power lines and turning the streets of Seattle into rivers of black glass. Arthur parked his white step van 3 blocks from Finch's estate, hidden behind a row of overgrown laurels. He moved with a heavy, focused intensity. He didn't use the front gate. He moved through the drainage tunnels he had mapped out months prior, emerging like a wraith in the center of Finch's perfectly manicured gardens. He knew the security routines, knew the blind spots of the cameras, and knew exactly when the night guard took his break. He was a shadow entering a fortress. Inside the house, the air smelled of floor wax and old money. Alistair Finch was in his study, a glass of 30-year-old scotch in his hand, oblivious to the fact that his resource value was currently being calculated by a man in a canvas coat. Arthur struck as Finch was reaching for a cigar. It was supposed to be a silent, surgical extraction. But Finch, despite his age, fought with the frantic, clawing energy of a man who realized his soul was being weighed and found wanting. In the struggle, a heavy brass lamp was knocked from the desk, shattering a window and triggering a silent alarm connected directly to the precinct. Arthur didn't panic. He applied the pressure point, felt Finch's body go limp, and shouldered the man like a side of beef. But as he retreated through the gardens, he made the mistake that would end his career. In his haste to clear the perimeter before the sirens arrived, he dropped a single blood-stained latex glove near the broken window. To any other detective, it was just trash. To Elias Thorne, it was a biological map. Arthur reached the van just as the first blue flashes appeared on the horizon. He didn't drive away slowly. He slammed the Chevy into gear and tore onto the I-5 South, the engine screaming in protest against the weight of the harvest. The chase was a nightmare of rain and steel. Detective Thorne was in the lead car, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his eyes locked on the rusted white box weaving through the midnight traffic. Don't let him reach the industrial district, Thorne roared into his radio. If he gets into those warehouses, we'll lose him in the fog. The police cruisers fanned out, their sirens a dissonant howl that cut through the thunder. Arthur drove with a terrifying, calm resolve. He wasn't trying to escape. He was trying to reach his temple in Ballard one last time. He wanted to finish the work. He wanted to feed the city. The end came at the intersection of Leary Way. A tactical pit maneuver sent the white van spinning across the wet asphalt, its tires shrieking until it slammed into a concrete bridge abutment. The impact was deafening. For a long moment, there was only the sound of hissing steam and the rhythmic clicking of the van's cooling engine. Thorne was the first one out of his car, his service weapon drawn, his heart hammering against his ribs. He approached the back of the van, the scent of industrial bleach now mixing with the heavy, sweet smell of a simmer that had gone on too long. When Thorne wrenched open the rear doors, the scene inside was a vision from a medieval hell. The interior was lit by a single, flickering fluorescent bulb that had survived the crash. There, amidst the stainless steel pots and the rows of surgical saws, lay Alistair Finch, bound but alive. But it was what was inside the pots that made the seasoned officers turn away and retch into the gutter. It was the remains of the Mercy Ration, the collective evidence of 5 years of disappearances, all reduced to a dark, savory broth. And in the center of it all sat Arthur Penhaligon, his face covered in blood and grease, clutching a silver ladle as if it were a scepter. He didn't resist. He didn't scream. He simply looked at Thorne with eyes that were terrifyingly lucid, even in the wreckage. "You're too late, Detective," Arthur whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "The city has already tasted the truth. I have fed the hungry with the very thing that was starving them. You can lock me away, but you can't take back the strength I gave them." As they hauled him out of the van and into the blinding rain, Arthur looked up at the towering buildings of Seattle one last time. He was no longer the surgeon. He was a martyr in his own mind, a man who had turned the meat of the powerful into the blood of the poor. The Last Supper was over, but the investigation into the Butcher of Mercy was only just beginning. The sirens had faded into a low, rhythmic pulse of blue and red, but the air in the Ballard district remained frozen, while Arthur Penhaligon sat in a cold interrogation room, refusing to speak. Detective Elias Thorne stood before the unassuming gray bungalow on the corner of the street. To the neighbors, this house was a symbol of quiet, working-class stability. But as the forensic teams began to cross the threshold, they realized they weren't entering a home. They were entering a tomb, a monument to a madness so methodical, so scrubbed of traditional sin, that it defied every criminal profile in the FBI's handbook. This was the moment where the Mercy Ration was stripped of its twisted nobility, leaving behind nothing but the cold, hard reality of the bone. The search began in the living room. It was a space of stifling, suffocating order. The lace doilies were perfectly centered on the end tables. The books on the shelves were alphabetized, their spines uncreased. There was no dust, no clutter, no sign of a life actually lived. It was a stage set, a meticulously maintained camouflage designed to deflect the eyes of the world. But as Thorne moved toward the kitchen, the scent began to change. The smell of pine needles and lemon wax gave way to the sharp, stinging bite of high-concentrate industrial bleach. It was a smell that didn't just fill the nose. It burned the back of the throat. It was the smell of a man trying to scrub the soul out of the floorboards. The entrance to the basement was hidden behind a heavy, reinforced oak door in the pantry. When Thorne swung it open, the temperature dropped 10 degrees. The air was thick with the hum of heavy machinery, the low, constant thrum of industrial-grade ventilation and deep well freezers. As the light from Thorne's flashlight swept across the room, the Cathedral of Bleach was finally revealed. The walls were lined with white ceramic tiles, every grout line polished to a mirror finish. In the center stood the preparation table, a massive slab of stainless steel that caught the light like a surgical tray. There were no bloodstains. There were no signs of a struggle. The room was so sterile, it felt like a laboratory, a place where the messiness of death had been processed into the cleanliness of a product. "Over here, detective," a forensic technician whispered, his voice shaking. He was standing in front of a row of neatly labeled shelves. Thorne stepped closer and felt his stomach turn into a knot of cold lead. Arthur hadn't kept traditional trophies. He didn't keep ears or locks of hair. He kept the impurities. On the shelves sat a series of glass mason jars, each one filled with clear preservative fluid. Inside were the things that the human body couldn't digest. A pair of gold-plated cufflinks belonging to Douglas Sterling. A heavy Rolex watch, its crystal cracked, that had once sat on the wrist of Judge Vane. A set of keys, a wedding ring, a single polished silver fountain pen. Each jar was meticulously labeled with a date and a weight. Arthur hadn't seen these people as victims. He had seen them as ledger entries. These were the leftovers of his great work, the non-recyclable remnants of the men he had fed to the city. Then came the freezers. When Thorne wrenched open the heavy lids, he found the winter stores. Neatly wrapped packages, vacuum sealed in heavy plastic, stacked with the precision of a professional grocery display. There was no gore, no jagged edges, only the pale, frozen reality of Arthur's harvest. In a corner of the basement, behind a false wall, they found the clothing. Hundreds of garments, expensive wool coats, silk ties, Italian leather shoes, all washed, pressed, and hung on racks like a macabre boutique. Arthur had planned to give these away too, part of a secondary charity that would have seen the homeless wearing the skins of the men who had oppressed them. But the most damning evidence was the ledger. It was a large leather-bound book found in a drawer beneath the prep table. In it, Arthur had recorded everything. He had written down the names of the resources, their social crimes, the herbs used in the broth, and the locations where the mercy ration had been served. It was a manifesto of madness, a document that proved Arthur Penhaligon didn't believe he was a killer. He believed he was an auditor of the human soul. He had calculated the net worth of every man he killed and redistributed that worth in calories to the starving. Thorne sat on a wooden crate in the center of that hellish kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of 50 lives erased. He realized that the gold bridge found by Benny was just the beginning. The scope of the horror was so vast, it threatened to swallow the department whole. Arthur hadn't just killed these people. He had deleted them from existence, turning their bodies into a dark, savory broth that now sat in the stomachs of thousands of people across 2 countries. As the sun began to rise outside, casting long, pale shadows across the Ballard streets, Thorne knew the case was won. The evidence was undeniable. The Butcher of Mercy was caught in his own trap. But as he looked at the jars of gold and silver, Thorne couldn't help but wonder how many more Saint Arties were out there, hiding in the rain, waiting for the city to get hungry enough to stop asking questions. The trial of Arthur Penhaligon wasn't just a legal proceeding. It was a cultural exorcism. In the spring of 1990, the eyes of the world turned toward a wood-paneled courtroom in Seattle. The media had dubbed him the Butcher of Mercy, a name that captured the terrifying duality of his crimes. To some in the forgotten corners of the city, he remained a dark folk hero, a man who had finally made the powerful pay a price they could feel. But to the law, he was a monster who had turned the most sacred human taboos into a production line. The case was a mountain of forensic certainty, built on a foundation of gold dental bridges and leather-bound ledgers. There was no room for doubt, only for the final, cold application of the state's ultimate weight. Arthur sat at the defense table like a man carved from the very granite of the courthouse steps. He didn't wear the traditional orange jumpsuit of a prisoner. He wore a simple, clean white shirt, buttoned to the neck. He didn't hide his face from the cameras. He didn't weep when the families of the victims, the Sterling family, the Vanes, the Finches, hurled their grief and fury at him from the gallery. He listened to the testimony with the same clinical detachment he had used to process their loved ones. When it was his turn to speak, he didn't ask for mercy. He didn't offer an apology. He stood before the jury and spoke in a voice that was as calm and steady as a heartbeat. "I didn't steal their lives," Arthur told the hushed courtroom, his eyes fixed on the judge. "I redistributed them. I took the excess of the few and used it to sustain the many. In a city that would rather watch a man starve than lose a single luxury condo, I was the only one practicing true economy. You call it murder. I call it a closed loop." The jury took less than 4 hours to return a verdict. Guilty on 50 counts of aggravated murder. The sentence was death. As the judge read the words, a silent ripple of relief went through the room. But Arthur simply nodded, as if he were approving a budget report. He was transported to the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, a place of high concrete walls and long, silent corridors. There, he would spend the next 15 years in a cell that was 6 feet by 9, a space even smaller than the back of his white Chevy van. The years on death row were a slow erosion. Outside, the world changed. The 1980s faded into the 90s, and the 90s bled into the turn of the millennium. The Seattle Arthur knew, the city of industrial grit and neon shadows, was being replaced by a gleaming metropolis of glass and software. The invisibles he had fed were being pushed further into the margins. Thorne, now a retired and weary man, visited Arthur once a year. They sat on opposite sides of the glass, two old hunters whose lives had been inextricably linked by a bowl of soup. Arthur never broke. He never showed remorse. He spent his days reading books on anatomy and philosophy, maintaining his cell with a level of cleanliness that unnerved the guards. The execution was set for a rainy Tuesday in May, 2005. The Pacific Northwest weather provided a fitting backdrop, the gray clouds hanging low over the prison like a heavy shroud. As per the protocol, Arthur was allowed a last meal. The guards expected him to ask for something extravagant, a final act of gluttony before the end. But Arthur, ever the man of discipline, made a request that Thorne would later describe as the ultimate irony. He asked for a single, unadorned bowl of beef broth and a slice of plain white bread. "I want to taste the simplicity of the gift," Arthur had whispered to the warden. On the night of the execution, as the chemicals were prepared in the sterile room, Arthur lay on the gurney with a look of profound peace. He didn't look like a killer. He looked like a man who had completed a long, difficult shift and was finally ready to clock out. As the first needle entered his vein, he looked toward the observation window, searching for Thorne. When their eyes met, Arthur offered a faint, almost imperceptible smile. It wasn't a smile of malice, but of recognition. The Butcher of Mercy was pronounced dead at 12:08 a.m. His body was cremated, his ashes scattered in an unmarked location by the state. He left behind no estate, no family, only the leather-bound ledger that now sat in a high-security evidence locker at the SPD. The case was closed, the monster was gone, and the city moved on.